Welcome to No Rares Required, Episode 9, Simic Ramp. Every week I discuss a drafting strategy for a different archetype, and today we will be covering my strategy for drafting Simic, or Green-Blue, in Brothers War. The archetype's theme is Power Stone Ramp, and I feel like it's a pretty accurate description of what Simic is trying to do. But it is worth noting that it has the lowest win rate on 17 lands of any archetype, and I think it is because to successfully draft Simic, you need to journey off the beaten path. And to start our journey, I recommend my top common for Simic, Citanul Stalwart. This card wheels, and to clarify for beginners or people who are new to draft, that means you see this card pick 9 or later when you get to choose your second card from the pack that has wheeled around the table back to you. This card is so integral to my strategy in Simic, I will take as many as I can get, and I think the fact that this card wheels says a lot about why people are struggling to find success with Simic. My next top tier common that I want as many as I can get is Excavation Explosion. Basically, my strategy goes like this. Pick up any bombs as long as they don't have a double pip outside of green or blue. Pick up single pip removal because cards like Citanul Stalwart and Ramping, they're not going to apply a lot of early pressure, and so you're going to find yourself in a longer, more interactive game, and therefore you want to value removal highly. And then I pick up Citanul Stalwart and cheap artifacts and cards that create power stones to enable a very flexible mana base. Excavation Explosion hits for 3 and it creates a power stone, which you can use to ramp to your colorless artifacts, and with Stalwart you can use your power stones to tap for any color. Similarly, Overwhelming Remorse is excellent single pip removal, and you should try to take as many as you can get. We're going for a longer strategy, so it isn't uncommon for this to have the time to develop into a single swamp instant speed removal that exiles. As I mentioned, Stalwarts are integral to my strategy. Gaia's Gift is a great way to protect them from early removal that can leave me in a lot of trouble. I tend to run 9 forests or green sources so that I can reliably cast Stalwart on turn 1. Then I treat each Stalwart as a rainbow mana color or mana source for splashing other cards. So it is quite common for me to be running far fewer than 17 lands. 14, for example, if I have 3 Stalwarts. And if my opponent removes my Stalwart, it is basically playing land destruction, and I end up with a handful of cards that I can't play. The good thing is Gaia's Gift goes reasonably late, so picking up multiples hasn't been a problem, especially if green is open. Since we're going for a late game strategy and ramping to big expensive creatures, I can't think of a better card than Boulderbranch Golem at the common level. I definitely want 1 or 2 to make up the top end of my deck. It gains you 6 life if you play it for its full cost, and in a pinch you can play it for its prototype cost of 3 and a green to gain 3 life and get a body on the board if you're getting run over by an aggro deck. Desynchronize is a card that I've mentioned in all of my guides that contain blue except for Izzet, but even there I've started to include 1 or 2 to make up the top end of my deck. It can be especially nice in Simic if you have a lot of removal. Since I'm going for a longer strategy, I need to have answers for my opponent's bombs, and bouncing their threat to the top of their deck and allowing me to scry 2 can give me the turn or 2 that I need to find the answer. Stern Lesson is a decent substitute to Excavation Explosion. I'd rather be removing my opponent's threats instead of drawing cards, but creating a Power Stone on turn 3 is definitely something that Simic wants to do. Similarly, Argothian Opportunist fits into the create a Power Stone on turn 3 strategy. I'd rather be running Excavation Explosion, but at least this gives me a blocker that I can use to remove an opponent's creature. Next on my list is cheap artifacts that can enable Citanul Stalwart to ramp. You want at the very least 7 1 or 2 cost artifacts in your deck so that you can reliably start ramping on turn 2 or turn 2 and turn 3. Combat Courier also works well in late game strategies, as you can use it to chump block and then draw a card to find more removal. Similarly, Scrapwork Mutt is a good artifact creature that can enable the ramp through Stalwart while also helping you smooth out your early plays and hit the right combination of cards and lands. And with Stalwart, you have access to all the colors in the rainbow, so unearthing this card later in the game is very possible. Scrapwork Cohort plays best in strategies that are aiming to go wide, but I like to include 1 or 2 in my Simic deck. It's a nice card to ramp to on turn 3. It gives you a 1/1 to tap with Stalwart for even more rampy goodness, and it plays as a good blocker, similar to Golgari, where I use it to stall to the late game. Evolving Wilds is also a card that I think you should take highly in Simic. Stalwart allows you to have a very flexible mana base, and Evolving Wilds makes it even more flexible. Also, since you are going for a late game strategy, you don't have to worry about this destroying your early pressure or tempo. Energy Refractor is also a card that I think you should take highly. It increases the flexibility of your mana base, and it is card neutral since it draws a card when it enters the battlefield, and it's a great target to tap with Stalwart since its ability doesn't require you to tap it. Last but not least, and the reason why I chose to talk about what Sam Black from Drafting Archetypes calls Stalwart Green. Mightstone's animation. Since we are going to be running 7+ cheap artifacts, it's nice to be able to turn them into a 4/4 and draw a card. It's a bit of a balancing act though, because this card performs best in Izzet and Dimir, which are very spell-heavy archetypes, much heavier than where I tend to end up in Simic. So I only want 1 or 2, but instead of as many as I can grab in Izzet and in Dimir. If you've been watching my other episodes of No Rares Required, it shouldn't come as a surprise that Static Net is my mythic level uncommon for Simic. If you've picked up enough Stalwarts, you'll have no problem playing Static Net. It's the best removal at the uncommon level. It removes any non-land permanent, it gains 2 life, and it creates a Power Stone. I will play as many of these as I can. Another card that shouldn't come as a surprise is Skyfisher Spider. It is great removal, and of all the archetypes, I think Simic is the easiest color to splash. You can remove any non-land permanent, and after Stalwarts have ramped, they tend to just sit on the board not doing very much, so they make great sacrifice fodder later in the game. Now, the next 3 cards I'm going to mention are very replaceable. They're just busted uncommons. And the nice thing about the Stalwart strategy is that you can play with all of the colors and all of the combinations and synergies that enables. So you basically can play any deck's strategy or any archetype strategy and use their busted uncommons. But these are the ones that will fit most easily into your Simic mana base. Thopter Mechanic is great to include since many of your cheap artifacts and cards like Mightstone Animation draw you cards. Zephyr Sentinel is a busted blue uncommon and is great to play in response to removal to save a creature. Zephyr Sentinel is also really good in Simic because it's a great way to protect your Stalwarts. And surprise, your Stalwarts are soldiers. So even just playing this to bounce your Sentinel after it has tapped for mana to create a 3/2 flash flyer can be more pressure than some decks can deal with, and is another reason why I think Stalwart Green plays really well in Simic specifically. Another busted uncommon is Abstinent Baloth. Since you're base green, you shouldn't have any problem with the double pip, and ramping to this on turn 3 is very satisfying. The 4 life also helps you stabilize against aggro strategies, and the 4 toughness gets around cards like Excavation Explosion and enemy Scrapwork cohorts. Next up, I'll list the gratuitous amount of 1 and 2 cost artifacts that you have at your disposal to combo off with your Stalwarts. Ashnod's Harvester is at the top of my list. It's a great blocker, and I've said it before and I'll say it again. Removing a problematic Unearth card can be critical. I'll happily take as many of these as I can get. Haywire Might is a cheap artifact that I don't usually recommend taking, but I do love them in Simic. Most importantly, it's a 1-cost card to enable Stalwart, but the life gain is nice in a late game strategy, and being able to remove a problematic non-creature artifact or enchantment, like, Static Net, can be very, very useful. Similar to Golgari, Mask of the Jade Crafter is a great value card for late game strategy, and it's also a cheap artifact that you can use to enable your Stalwarts. Mishra's Bauble is the cheapest way to enable your Stalwarts at 0, and after you're all done ramping, you can sacrifice it to draw a card. Mishra's Research Desk is also a cheap way to enable Stalwart, and you should have access to red, and so you'll be able to unearth it and get additional value. Similarly, Chromatic Star and Elsewhere Flask are great because they're cheap artifacts and they're card neutral. Now for the rares. It's important to have something that you're ramping to in Simic, and Titania's Command is perfect top end. As I've mentioned, you're almost always going to be creating 2 2/2 bear tokens when giving your whole board 2 permanent +1/+1 counters. So even on an empty board, you get a value of 8/8 for 6. This is the best rare in the set, and perfectly at home in Simic. Now, as I've done in the past, I'm going to give a quick mention to some rares that are great to include but are better in different archetypes. Steel Seraph is best in Celestia, Precursor Golem is best in Dimir and Gruul, and Skystrike Officer is best in Azorius. They're all great to include in your Simic strategy, but if I open them up and pack one, pick one, my mind tends to go to their best archetype. The Mightstone and Weakstone, however, is best in Simic. In a deck where I'm usually trying to hit 9 colorless mana for reasons that will soon be revealed, Mightstone and Weakstone fits perfectly. The -5/-5 gets rid of almost every threat your opponent is running, and if I pack one, pick one this, my mind immediately goes to Simic. Mazemind Tome is also best in Simic. It fits perfectly into the Stalwart strategy as a cheap artifact, and then the card draw and life gain is perfect for the late game strategy. After ramping, you also tend to have a bunch of mana lying around, and this can help you dig to your top end. Now for some rares that I only want to play in Simic. Keening Stone is a great way to use your excess mana after ramping, and is a nice win condition in and of itself, since you'll be able to mill them in a couple of turns. Also, late in the game, you can use this as an 11-cost I win the game, which can be very satisfying. Now to a couple other rares worth mentioning. Teething Wormlet is surprisingly good in Simic, since you have a lot of cheap artifacts, but I tend to think of Gruul because it's better in a mid-range strategy. Similarly, Simian Simulacrum is a good inclusion, but I also tend to lean towards Gruul when I open up that card. Liberator Urza's Battlethopter is a good inclusion in Simic since you're aiming to play expensive cards, which means it will grow every single turn, and you can turn it into a truly massive flyer. But I think it's still best in a flying strategy deck like Azorius. My last rare for Simic is Tokashia Digsite Mentor. This can help you use your Stalwarts late in the game, after they're done ramping, to filter through your deck and to go find your bombs. You can also use her ability to reanimate some of your big bombs, like Cityscape Leveler. This card is a powerhouse. That is, if you can play it. When I open this card, my mind immediately goes, well, I guess it's time for Simic. It immediately destroys an opponent's non-land permanent, turning it into a measly little Power Stone, and then it does it again each time that it attacks. And, as a little bonus, You might also have some Gaia's Gifts to protect this thing from removal. It's great in every deck that lasts long enough, but it is definitely my Simic superstar. Similarly, Portal to Phyrexia wins you the game, if you can play it. This is a great card to ramp to, especially because it pairs nicely with your rainbow removal that I mentioned earlier. And it's best if you can play it before your opponent has gone wide and can afford to sacrifice 3 1/1 tokens, for example. Similar to Cityscape Leveler, this card is great in many decks, but my mind goes to Simic if I open this up, pack one, pick one. So, thank you for enjoying my simple guide to Simic, and I hope it helps you escape the low win rate that many people have experienced with this archetype. Please take a moment to click like and subscribe to help support me. I really do appreciate it. You can also catch me Monday through Friday at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern on Twitch. We only have one more archetype left, Orsov, and then it will be time for All Will Be One, available on Magic the Gathering Arena February 7th. Thank you all for the support, and I'll see you next week.